Those
Oh,
pesky details in supplier contracts that no one wants to talk about except Maren Nelson, ladies and gentlemen. Put your hands together for Maren Nelson.
thank you. So unlike the previous comment, this is not about pesky suppliers. This is about the details in supplier contracts. And let me see if I'm actually going to be able to advance my slides here. There we go. So the QMS does a pretty good job. I'm going to go through this quickly of talking about what the supplier selection process is. You get your criteria, you choose your candidates, you evaluate them, you get your suppliers all selected, and you think, great, I'm done. No, now you have to write the contract. So writing the contract is not something I appreciated when I was an engineer because I figured it was sort of standard. There's a lot of ways that you can go wrong in writing a contract. And we look a lot at, talking to suppliers about capabilities and expertise and qualities and quantities and prices and all of those kind of good things. So these get a lot of focus. But there's some things that at least I have been burned in my past where we didn't think about the details in advance, and it becomes very difficult when things go wrong. Let's start out and just take a look at specifications. So what could be wrong or what could be a problem with the specifications for a product? So sometimes design use off-the-shelf components, but the engineers choose to put them in place where it's outside the specification, like it's above the temperature range or it's outside the humidity range. Anytime you hear an engineer say,
no, okay,
well, it's not in the specs, but we checked 5 of them and they passed, all kinds of red flags should go up on this because you're essentially using an unspecified characteristic. Sometimes you can't anticipate it. When we went through the whole RoHS change years ago, manufacturers didn't worry as much about putting the detailed material compositions in their specs. Now we need to worry about that for material. What a lot of engineers and sometimes suppliers and purchasers miss is that if you're using a part outside the specification, you've taken an off-the-shelf part and you've turned it into a custom part. And you say, well, Maren, what does that really mean? It means it's a custom part only for your company based on the way that you're using it. So if the supplier makes a change and the OTS part they're shipping still meets their specification, but that part no longer works in your application because you're using it outside the spec, it's not the supplier's fault. It's not the supplier's problem. I have on numerous occasions had many people in the company say, but we're ordering the same part. We're ordering this off-the-shelf part. And when you dig into it, they're using it in a way that's not consistent with the specs. They've made it a custom part, but they're not treating it like a custom part. Anybody else run into this?
I ran exactly into that. we had a microcontroller and it was designed under specs. It was at 10 megahertz and you used it on 7.8 or something.
Mm-hmm.
And then it should be a ROAS part later on. And they said, well, let's take the new part for designing a new part. But the new part still had the same specs. It was from 10 megahertz to, I don't know, 50. They did no longer work again at 7.8 megahertz. So
yep.
It was not.
So you were using it at a frequency lower than what the spec limit was.
What the specs were saying, yeah.
Yeah.
Not my fault, by the way.
No, I mean, it's a really big thing. So how does this affect your contract? Right, because we're talking about the contract details. So,
Maren.
Yes, go ahead, Robert or Bob.
I just want to make sure I understand this correctly. So if let's say DigiKey sends me something because they say it's like an equivalent replacement, and it doesn't work on my embedded system, you're saying it's not DigiKey's fault? Don't they have the burden to explain to me that this is like their equivalent, but it might not work? I mean, if your vendor is changing parts on you, don't they have like a duty to inform me that they're changing parts? It may not be the same. It automatically, it's like I have the burden. Is that what you're saying?
So if they
Depends on
are,
how your contract's written, I think.
thank you, Jen, it's a great setup.
I'm just talking about law of the land. You know, I don't want to
So-
get into legalese, but just like as a common industry practice, the burden of me getting parts for my embedded system is 100% on me when my vendor can swap out parts on their end.
No, that's not what I'm saying.
Okay, good.
When you get that part, it comes with a big, long specification associated with it that
Right.
tells you what the limits of that part are.
And that burden's on the supplier who's changing out the parts in their supply chain.
Right.
Okay, good.
So-
All right.
So as Luke was saying, they were using an off-the-shelf part, which had a clock range of 10 to 50 megahertz. But they were using it 7.8 because
Yeah.
they'd experimentally tried it and it works at 7.8. Well, it's not in the specs, but we checked 5 and they passed.
So in that case, it would be the supplier's fault if I had a problem and they didn't tell me that they were-
No, because you're using the part in a way that is outside the specification. You're using a 7.8
And I'm talking
megahertz.
about my specifications. I don't care about their specifications. I care about my specifications.
Yeah, but Bob, if you have a new part, then your supplier is supposed to inform you that it's going obsolete. And
Right,
then,
right.
And normally what they do is they give you a last time buy option, and then you have to calculate how much you need for the upcoming time, and you buy it. Or what you do is the supplier says, I have an alternative part, and they give it to you, you test it, and you say, okay, it works in my system. Let's do a redesign, or I changed my bill of materials with the new part, and it works as good as the old one.
Okay,
But
cool. Okay.
That's normally how it goes.
Yeah.
But I wanna go back.
Okay,
So-
cool. That answers my
so-
question.
If your specification for that part is different than the supplier's specification for that part, then you have turned it into a custom part for your company.
Actually, Maren, can I actually give an example? One of the examples I had, and I'm going to use it as equipment specifically, but it's actually the same. If your supplier has a wider operating range for megahertz for whatever reason, but you need to operate at a specific tighter range, that's where the custom factor comes into play. And so if they've modified it and now the tighter range that you need no longer works, that's where the problem she's talking about. So
Yeah.
if you're using an off the part and they have that's where I think, did I get it, Maren?
That's another way. Let me give an example that was from my experience. We were buying an off-the-shelf LED display.
Mhm.
The spec for that display was that you could have up to, I think, 15 non-working pixels in the display. Our application said we could only have 4.
Right.
So we were creating a custom part because our spec was tighter than the manufacturer's. So if the manufacturer was shipping us units that had 2 or 3, and then they started shipping us units that had 10 or 12, they were still within their spec, but they were no longer within our spec, and that's on us.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I get it. I gotta be careful. Okay.
Yeah, well, and it is a very easy trap to fall into, because if you're getting parts that are working, even if they're tighter than the spec, it kind of looks like everything's okay. But then it's a change that happens and it doesn't work.
Right. I mean, working in the operating room, this trocar is not the equivalent of this trocar. They look the same, they act the same, but they're not the same.
Right.
And the only person who really understands is like the end user. So it just, for me, the idea of custom to me is like a custom surfboard or a custom car. So I just had to make that translation into what we're talking about here. So thank you for that.
Yeah. It's an off-the-shelf part is per that manufacturer's specification.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
Yeah.
I
I
actually had another example where the engineers found the capability to use something outside the recommended supplier range that functioned well for their device, and that made it a custom part as well. And so,
Mhm.
it's not just within range; it's out. If it doesn't meet 100% of the supplier spec, then it's a custom part.
And I had that problem with bottles, believe it or not. We were buying off the shelf bottles, but I found out their specifications for heights was outside the normal specification for the industry. And I was trying to get them to go to the industry standard rather than their standard, because they went and changed the neck mold and made the bottles 1/8 of an inch taller, and it wouldn't run through our machines. But they kept saying, well, it's in our spec. And I'm going, I've been working with you to get to industry specs, not to what your specs are, which aren't industry standards. So we had a lot of fun with that one.
Yeah, but technically they were giving you the spec and they were
Yes.
meeting their specs. So yeah.
Yeah, they were meeting their spec, but it wasn't industry spec. So yeah, we had fun with that one.
So the way you think about this in a contract is you can actually create the custom part in the contract, which talks about the additional screening characteristic, which is what we ended up doing with the displays. We had the supplier create basically a custom part for us that only had no more than 4. You can ask for additional notification on any part change. Generally, the supplier only notifies you if the specifications change. You can say, look, we know we're using the part out of range. Anytime you make a change, we need to do our own verification to make sure it's still working in our application.
Question on that one.
Yep.
Do you have to put it into the contract if they're not making their own, they're getting it from somewhere else, that they notify you when that somewhere else changes?
Well, you can ask for anything you want to in the contract, but yeah, I mean, I think you can try for that. These are all options. Michelle?
Yes. So I have a question. If I were to use the parts out of the specification, become a custom parts, does that make my device a custom device, or is still whatever the device you define?
Well, the device is the device is a custom part because you're the only one that owns the specifications for it. So let me talk a little bit. I divide my part world up into 2 very black and white buckets because I find it makes legal and other aspects much better. You are either buying a part from a supplier who owns that specification and controls the specification. So if you're buying, an off-the-shelf strap or an off-the-shelf electrical component or anything like that, the supplier owns and is responsible for the specification. If your company, as a medical company, owns any part of the specification or makes any part of the specification, like your bill of materials for your product, that's a custom part. So custom part means the company owns the specification. Off the shelf means the supplier owns the specification.
Okay, because we're doing some MDR paperwork and they're very sensitive to the word custom made. So I just want to make sure that.
That's a different definition of custom than I'm using here.
Okay.
That would be custom is individualized for each person. That's a different definition.
Does a notice of change, Maren? Does a notice of change make it already a custom part?
No.
Because if you have a product and you have to test it at a test house, the test house may decide that some parts are critical for safe performance, so they put it on the critical component list.
Yep.
And you're not allowed to change anything in a critical component before having consulted with the test house again to say, yes, the change in this critical component is allowed or not.
So I generally, the change in the critical component is at the specification level, unless of course you're using it outside the spec.
I don't know, it's in a specification. Usually a part is tested as part of a whole system. It's also there in the critical component list. This part is on the critical component and it has these this manufacturer part number, and this is what it is. And they just say you cannot change anything in this component without consulting us first.
And if it is really, you can't change anything, like you want to have any notifications of the changes of that component, whether or not they affect the spec, then
normally if they change the color, it won't affect the performance, but you have to, even if they change the color, you have to get back to the test house, say, hello there, our manufacturer has changed the color. Are you okay with it? Because it
Yeah.
changes the critical component.
So in that case, I would say you would want to write into your contract that you want additional notification for any part change, not
Yes.
because it's necessarily a custom component, but because you need that level of control over it.
Yes.
Yeah. In the contract, if you want to try to put a clause in, you're going to do your own screening. Like if the company I worked at wanted to screen the LEDs coming in or the screens coming in for only 4 broken pixels, but we wanted to be able to ship everything else back to the manufacturer for a full refund, that would be something I would want to address in advance in the contract. And if you ignore it and you just kind of take it all in, then the default is the company will take on all the costs of the screening, the scrap, regulatory, everything like that. So that's why you want to think about these things in advance and make sure that you're putting mitigations in the contract if you can. So one of the other areas is, you know, if you're using a contract manufacturer who says, well, we're going to take care of everything, right? You're all done. They're taking care of everything. No, you're not all done. You are still accountable as the company for all of those control of all of those different manufacturing areas. And I have seen more than one instance of a company who says, oh, my contract manufacturer is taking care of that. And they have totally disengaged. They just send them, here's how many units we want to ship. And the contract manufacturer is doing everything else without any oversight from the company. So even if they're doing everything right, you still have to show that you're being responsible as the manufacturer. So what I would say, and what I generally do, is you want to capture at least a high-level process risk analysis of the fulfillment flow for your company. And even if you're just looking at the process step, what can go wrong at that? What's preventing it? And is it good enough right now? That's a huge benefit in the contract writing. So it kind of moves you toward a final risk assessment for manufacturing, but you don't need all the detail. And typically contracts are being done earlier in the development process, so you won't have all the detail yet. So just looking around sourcing, for example, right? It's like, oh, well, you're just buying the parts. How hard can that be? Here's some of the questions that I would ask. So who is selecting the suppliers, particularly the sub-tier suppliers? Is the contract manufacturer selecting all the suppliers, or does the company want a hand in selecting the suppliers? And if you have a company selecting suppliers for a contract manufacturer, it can get messy pretty quickly. So particularly if the company wants to select a particular supplier, who's going to write that sub-tier supplier contract? Since it's the company that did the selection, are they now responsible for writing the supplier contract? Is the company going to ask the contract manufacturer to write that supplier contract? If the contract manufacturer is selecting the suppliers, does the company want any oversight or any review on who those suppliers are? Who's going to actually order the parts? Who's providing the forecast? Who's managing or auditing the sub-tier supplier? You got excess inventory. Who's managing it, right? You get into all these questions about who owns which pieces, who's responsible for day-to-day execution, who's responsible for paying, who's responsible for issues. And I have seen some really convoluted sourcing situations where a company insists that they want to get 2 or 3 specific sub-tier suppliers, but they don't want to manage them. And so they select them, but they try to just assume that the contract manufacturer is going to manage them. And it becomes a mess, particularly if there's a problem or a recall, and there's all kinds of finger pointing and legal, your legal costs ratchet up very quickly. So any other stories around this type of thing? Or am I unique in that this has been my experience?
No, it's
Well, you
been
want to use your outside
freaky.
voice and tell us what you wrote?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's the FDA approved facilities is there for a reason, right? And in a perfect world, because I do represent, work with Extron, we've lost deals because for everything you talk about, Maren, right? Clients want to save money, they think we're too costly, but it takes effort and protocol and process is very different when you are an FDA registered facility like Extron, where we do it right. I mean, I literally, to your point, people wanting to cut corners. I lost 2-3 deals, last year itself. They freaking went to Mexico, and they needed to be, in a very structured ecosystem and environment. But yeah, so what you're suggesting is the reality very often. But I think, there's a lot of education that needs to happen, because when you do go to an FDA registered facility, a lot of this is addressed properly and the communication is there. But it costs money, and a lot of these people don't want to pay up. They don't want to show up. Then they kick the can down the road, and I suppose then litigation and this and that and warning letters and everything else kicks in. But you're right. I think education is what we do, right? You got to educate, but you got to hold your ground. It costs money to do it right.
And the point is, it costs money. It also costs money in time up front in the contracting process to make sure you get these expectations clear. And what I see in a lot of startups is they just want to get the contract written, and they want to get going on it, and they don't want to spend the time thinking about this. So they'll put some general or kind of high-level text in the contract about who's managing the sub-tier suppliers. But if it's not written down as a specific contract manufacturer responsibility, what they don't realize is that falls back on the company.
Oh, no doubt. Yeah. I mean, they hold the bag, right? It's their company, so.
Yeah, the company ends up holding the bag, so it's worth the time to put in thinking about.
But
these are the kind of pesky details that nobody wants to think about up front.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I always, obviously my anchor here is I'm a supply chain guy, right? And I always say there's two things I say: supply chain as a customer engagement strategy, and supply chain as a risk management strategy. Those are really important, but they don't see them that way. They always say supply chain and cost and reduce cost and all that stuff. But guys, there's so much more that goes into putting, the right supply chain solution together, given all the risks. You're bringing forth the compliance issues. I deal with other issues as well,
Well, and it's not medical compliance. A lot of this is legal compliance.
No doubt, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm glad you're on the call today. I put this in specifically for you.
Oh, thank you.
And do you actually build this into the consulting agreement or the business agreement? Where do you find that this detail should reside?
Well, let me jump in from my supply chain standpoint. It's really the primary, call it culture. It's really a business conversation. Is the client asking the right questions? Because when they come to me, they chew on, like, hey, what's your price? What's this? What's that? And then they don't realize that to do it right according to the business, because it's risk management at the nth level, right? We can obviously, it becomes a contractual thing because we say, hey, do you want to do it right? And then, we have to lean on these kinds of guidelines, wrap them into the contract to protect the client. But then if they want to start cutting corners, we can kick the can down the road. But we choose to maintain, because we want to maintain our own FDA compliance.
Yeah.
Right? Because we're registered and we can get audited at any given time. And it's happened last year in April, it happened. They just walked in one day. Right. So my point is, it becomes, I deal it at the contractual level, and we say, this is what we recommend, and these are our standards. We don't cut corners around it, because for us, maintaining our compliance and our registry, relationship with the FDA is absolutely critical. Because we've got, Abbott and people that work for 20 years with us, right? 22-year-old relationship. So it comes, I think it's at the business and contractual level. And then you just say, hey, we want to play the game right. And this is just this. Now it's a cultural issue. What are the standards of care that you operate within?
And I think you can still bring it back around to a cost issue. It's like you can position it as a pay me now, pay me later type of thing, or spend the money now or spend the money later. And sometimes if you put it in terms of, you can cut costs now, but here's where you may end up doing a recall, brand erosion, all kinds of stuff in the future. Sometimes that'll help with the education part. Michelle?
Yes, I kind of agree with Paul that this should be like a business contract, because I just want to use a real example that I dealt with during 2021 and 2022 because of the supply chain shortage and certain components of our medical device, such as the reed switch and the solenoid. It's really hard to get and have this extremely long lead time. And our customer definitely wants to have that. So there was some kind of contract drawn up like, okay, we can source in X amount within certain time at such cost. But if you don't use up within 6 months or 9 months, then we have to scrap them or you have to buy them back. So that all being detailed. And as long as both parties agree, and I don't think that's an issue because, shortly after COVID started, everything is hard to get, even CPUs, and you have to pay 10 times than what you have to pay previously. So everybody was really concerned and they all want to maintain the safety stock level at a certain, expectation. So it was pretty chaotic. So during those 2-3 years, we wrote about, I think 10, material agreement. I guess I lose to use the term, just outline how much should be sourced in, how much should be maintained. I mean, how many should be maintained, what level, so on and so forth. So I agree with Paul, that's a business contract.
Yeah, and it sounds like you're bringing up another important point on the business contract, which is the terms that you can ask for in the contract sometimes depends upon what the market demand is. So sometimes those have to get adjusted, but there are contracts that are written where those details are not specified. And those are the ones that I have seen that become problematic. So yeah, this is all sort of outside QMS scope in a lot of cases. It impacts QMS, but a lot of it is legal and financial. Let's see, go on.
Maren,
Yeah.
when would you put something in a business contract versus a quality agreement? Because I would think a lot of this would be in a quality agreement, which I keep as kind of a separate from like the supply and business agreement.
So the quality agreement, at least, and I'm not a contract expert, but generally the quality agreement would apply to any products or projects that are going on in the company. So if you have a general agreement that, for example, the contract manufacturer always selects the sub-tier suppliers or something like that, it could go in a quality agreement. If that's more on a product by product basis with who's going to be selecting suppliers or managing or buying or things like that, then I would see it going more into a business contract that covers that specific product. So I would say it depends on the scope of, whether it's cultural, like Paul is talking about, or whether it's specific for individual products. Anybody else have an opinion on that? So,
David?
David?
Yes, I'm coming. I need to read something here on the screen. So listening to this, I think we need to differentiate purchasing a new bunch of computers. And if you've ever bought a computer, we have no idea where the motherboard came from or the other board or the other board or the transistors. The manufacturer of those controls it. But I was waiting for Michelle Lott to pop up, and I'm glad she just did. But when you go into the quality system regulation, there are purchasing controls. 820 part 50, I think, yeah. And it runs easily. Each manufacturer shall establish and maintain procedures to ensure that all purchased or otherwise received products and services conform to specified requirements. So you don't go off the shelf. I mean, you can if you don't have any more tighter specifications. In my experience, I would order screws, or somebody would order screws or silicone material or something, and we would tell the supplier, this is our specification. Whatever Luke or somebody said earlier, 10 megahertz, and he was working at 7.5. We wouldn't have accepted the off-the-shelf product to put into a medical device. We might have taken it to put into plumbing supplies or computers if we were builders of those, but not in the medical world, having to follow the quality system regulation. Evaluating suppliers, contractors, and consultants. Each manufacturer shall establish and maintain requirements, including quality to be met by the contractor's consultants. And then if you read 820.50, it runs through everything like that. As the manufacturer, as the one putting the product on the market medically, we are the responsible party. We're responsible for our subcontractors. I would say we become responsible for subs because we're looking at our manufacturer of the component and they have specifications. And if they start making it incorrectly or dimensionally, or the bottles are higher than they used to be, that causes medical problems for us under the quality system. So I just don't want to be, I want to be sure that we're not mixing up, buying something for a non-medical product versus a medical product, because we have QSR to deal with.
I don't think that we are, but having
Good.
made complex medical products like defibrillators, some of the products that we buy to put in a defibrillator are based on our assessment of the manufacturer's specification.
And that's acceptable. Then in our purchasing agreement, we say we will accept product component X from you with these given specs that you created. And the next paragraph or something says, if you make changes to this spec, you must inform us. So,
Yeah,
and you're probably getting there. You're probably getting there.
Well,
Thank
that
you.
was what we talked about with the specifications, right?
Yep.
In
Okay.
Luke's case, if they want a part that works at 7.5 megahertz, they need to include that in the contract to the supplier.
Yes.
Yep.
Thanks.
Agreed.
Well, and if I can just expound on David's point there about, the QSR, it's going to get even more complicated for supplier management with QMSR that comes into effect in 2026. And that's because they have defined customer property now as being required to be addressed. But I cannot, and I think I'm going to email them about this. I cannot figure out for the life of me what they mean by this, because they say in the comment about what does customer property mean, it says, for example, a manufacturer is expected to ensure that the integrity of a component provided by a contract manufacturer is not compromised before it is incorporated into the device being manufactured. And I'm like, okay, so we're adding a new requirement for customer property. But in this case, FDA is defining the company who's buying the component as the customer, and it's their property that they have to control. And I'm like, well, how is this different from receiving an inspection or supplier controls?
Sounds like the same thing to me.
Exactly.
Yeah. And that is exactly the questions that you write in the manufacturing contract. For example, if the company is receiving parts and then sending them to the contract manufacturer, which is a situation I've seen, you need to be very clear in the contract who's responsible for the incoming inspection, who's responsible for making sure that that correct part was received.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But a lot of times in the contract, it'll just say, oh, I'm going to buy it, I'm going to ship it to you on a certain basis, and it doesn't go into those details on who's actually checking the part. David?
Sorry, I think my hand is up. I'll get rid of it or something.
Okay. And again, the point here is there are legal, business, and other questions that go into the contract beyond what the quality management system would say. Just in terms of excess inventory. And so there's a lot of financial thoughts outside the quality aspects that you really want to think about as a business when you're writing these contracts. So what about ownership? Particularly around IP. And this is very interesting, I think, particularly if you've got a new material or something coming out, because one of the primary reasons that a company uses external resources is because they've got expertise, knowledge, or experience that you don't have in your company. Well, that means those external resources have potential IP and special knowledge that they want to protect. But your goal is to make sure you're protecting all the IP that you can. So I've gotten many contracts for consulting services that say anything created during the course of this contract we own. And I have to go back and say, I would like an exception clause to say that if I'm bringing knowledge into this relationship, I still own that knowledge when I come out on the other side. Because I've had contracts which literally would own my entire business because they want all of my knowledge. And if I wrote an SOP for them that says confidential, then I can't use that anywhere else. So you need to think kind of specifically about which IP you may have to license or get rights to versus which IP you might actually own and have ability to go on in the future. And I think this is particularly interesting when you start talking about, like, your company has a really cool new plastic that you've developed. And you've got all the international patents around the material that you've got, or the compound or the formulation or whatever it is. But in order to make this, it requires a new manufacturing process and our tools. So you're going to work with a contract house to develop this great new process and tools. And then you run into questions like, well, who's actually going to pay for the tooling, or who paid for it? Did you get a, we'll set up this for you for a single cost and we'll buy all the tooling and get everything done? Or did you actually pay specifically for the tooling? Who's going to own the IP for the manufacturing process in that tool? Is it the manufacturer that developed this? Is it you because it's your material they're developing it for? Did you talk about it in your contract up front? Right? This is where your protection for that new process really needs to get covered. Because if you didn't talk about it, you could have this really cool new plastic, but you don't own the way to manufacture it, which puts you in a really awkward position as a company.
May I add something to it?
Absolutely.
One charming way to deal with this is that you have a contract in which you say, in our market, we want to have exclusivity, but if you can use this process in another market, it's all yours. Because then you both win. The manufacturer who has the manufacturing process, he can scale up and use it in other markets while you still protect your own market.
Yep.
And then,
so in that case, you covered it in your contract, right?
Yes, and then even if the manufacturer finds new markets, it usually means he can reduce production cost or tooling cost or whatever. So you both benefit from it.
I think that's a great solution. Yeah, the point with all of this is that sometimes I'll look at schedules from companies and they'll allow a week to write a supplier contract. And to think through all these things and look at the risks, as Paul was saying, takes more than a week, right? Writing a contract specifically for if it's like they're manufacturing your product, it just takes time to think through all these implications. So the last one I wanted to talk about, because it's always one of my favorites, is what do you do about the information? So, typical kind of manufacturing information, you've got your device master record, which I tend to think of as the recipe, and you've got your device history file information, which is batch cookies, each batch cookies that you make. A key piece of this is you need to be able to show you've got company review and approval for release. And why do you need that? Well, going back to what David and Michelle were saying, it's the company's responsibility to show that you've got sufficient control over the manufactured product to make sure what you're shipping meets all the specifications. Whether you do that by reviewing records or by reviewing process validations, right? There's multiple ways that you can show this sufficient control. But if you don't have anything in the system that shows that you had that oversight, then you're not in compliance with the QMS. More than that, you're putting your company at risk because you're not adequately looking at your products before they go out to make sure, from a branding perspective, that you're maintaining the quality. So, really big thing. How do you show that you've got sufficient control over the manufactured product? And if you haven't written anything into your contract to say, this is the information that we're getting out, or this is where we need to approve before the product can move forward, you got a huge miss in your contract. And I do see a lot of contracts where people focus on the price and the quality and the volumes and all of that, and they write nothing in the contract about what information gets shared. So really big miss. Where else might you need information? How long does it take me to get my production records if I'm sitting in an audit with an FDA inspector in front of me and all of my device history records are at a manufacturer in China? Maybe I need to do a recall and I need to do an assessment in like 2 days of how much product is affected out in the field. If I can't get that information, I'm recalling everything, right? Some huge business costs here. Can I still get my production records after 10 years? Can I get the production records if my manufacturer goes out of business or is sold? It was very interesting to me when Medtronic bought Nellcor many years ago, because Nellcor was providing products to a lot of Medtronic's competitors. Well, what happens to those records now that Medtronic owns the company? Do I want to get my own copy of the production records monthly? Can I even read the production records if I don't have the same ERP system? Again, think about this as you're writing the contract and make sure that you're protecting the company to get the information out that you need to continue to run your business. Don't just say, oh, my contract manufacturer has all my records. Because if they do, there's no guarantee you're going to get them back out again. So again, before you write a contract, think about all of these types of topics in addition to the other ones, and write your contract for the future.
So, Maren, it's really interesting that you bring up the DHR and LHR. I usually try to negotiate that they either scan or provide us a copy either at the end of the month or the end of the quarter, because the on-demand within 24 to 48 hours never works. You don't get it, and then there's delays, and then you don't. I mean, I actually had an instance where I was in an FDA audit, and they sent the LHRs, and they were all in Chinese, and so then the auditor wrote us a 483 saying, you don't have them translate your law history records, and because the client negotiated, it was out of my control, they negotiated on demand. Yeah, I never saw them because I didn't need them. And so I'm like, well, I guess we're going to have to accept this one. So, I mean, there's all kinds of issues. They don't like it. A good contract manufacturer doesn't care. They're like, I'll send them to you, no big deal. But the ones that don't want to, I start to get suspicious about, to be honest with you. It's like, what do you want to hide?
I agree with you. I think that I want those records that I can access them when I need them. So I try to put something similar in. Yes.
Yeah, hi, it's Johan.
So
my question is, can you hear me? Okay, my question is that in Europe, the notified bodies have a right to make unannounced audits to our suppliers and subcontractors. So how is it in the USA? Is FDA allowed to visit your contract manufacturers' facilities?
Paul, I'll let you answer that one.
Yeah, that's a good segue to what I was wanting to pipe in on about. So FDA will only go to registered facilities, right? Initially, they don't have the bandwidth, based on my perspective, to keep chasing you down, unless. So that's my take. Unless something happens and they get notified and they want to do research, and then forget about it. They're going to really come down on every detail. So because they're not going to go to China, right? They're going to come to you and say, give me the information, give me the details, what's your process, and validate it. And it gets very complicated when your partners are not following guidelines. By the way, the comment, I hope that answers your question. That's why it's very important to work with FDA registered facilities for the sake of risk management in the long haul. Yep. And also be very careful with the manufacturing consultants. So everything you're talking about, and very often there's, what does the customer want? Like there's this question that Ed is asking about, scrap rates. A lot of those details in contract manufacturing are usually left to the role of the manufacturing consultant. And we work with them a lot. And they're very good in between, because the client, the end customer, the company that's producing the product, it is, those executives don't have the level of detail that you're talking about, Mar. I mean, it's amazing how much education goes in the process. So very often they just offshoot that. They rely on a contract manufacturer who will go through all the details, and bring in all should know all the guidance and compliance. But those guys are going to work with the manufacturers, the CMs that they have a relationship with most often.
Yeah, exactly. That's
right?
why select the supplier is such a touchy issue sometimes.
Right. So my point is, I think, education along the path is very important, and, working with registered facilities, which is why, and forgive me, this is going to sound like a plug for Extron, but it does make sense, right? It's very important to ignore China, but post-pandemic, because their pricing, their supply chain, access to components, vendors, parts, sub-assemblies is just amazing. But there's a huge shift in the supply chains that are happening, right? So Vietnam is very fast becoming a reliable partner. India, Thailand, in Asia, those are becoming very reliable partners. I helped, not medical device, but there are a lot of companies moving from Shenzhen into Guadalajara, into Mexico. Mexico is fast becoming a reliable partner. The hybrid models are important. So even in Mexico, when I brought GoPro in from Shenzhen to Guadalajara, we brought 70% of the subcomponents from Shenzhen. Use supply chains from China, but control the IP. Do that assembly in a country that protects your IP, right? So you can do it in the US. So it's that hybrid model. And then my recommendation is use an FDA registered facility to slap everything together. Because now, because when we do procurement, right, at Extron, when we do procurement, we're making sure that, because the final product has to be within compliance, we're making sure the suppliers. So now you can get 2 suppliers, bring redundancy into the sourcing of subcomponents.
Right.
Supply chains are very shaky. They still are shaky. They haven't gotten back, right? So that model of finally doing the final assembly in an FDA registered facility, I think, is the sweet spot. You got to figure out the right partner who can scale with you, and then as your business scales, you might have to switch. But if this last mile manufacturing piece is in a FDA registered facility, you have a much greater chance to reduce the overall risk in product production.
I encourage
And I will-
anyone who's going to be at 10X
I wanna
next
make
week
one
to spend.
comment
Am I
on
on
his-
mute? No. Excuse me. I encourage anyone who's going to be at 10X next week to spend some quality time with Paul, because he is a really good resource for that.
Thank
I
you.
wanted to say, Maren, that was a really solid presentation, especially slide 8, and it gave me an idea for you and for others who are active in self-promotion on LinkedIn. I think especially slide 8, but each of those slides could be a post in and of itself, where you say, DM me or say, yes, please, if you'd like the rest of this presentation and you want to talk about this. And Michelle, I think you have a lot of content like that we never really used that way. So just a thought. Luke, you'll close us out today.
Oh, I couldn't agree more that it is an excellent presentation. There's only one thing that I miss. You had a bullet point saying you have to have detailed expectations, but there's always unspoken assumptions, and assumptions is the mother of all.
You know what?
You know what? And but you cannot do without them. Like there's a product I cannot disclose, but you can compare it with. Suppose you buy a car and then the car is coming and it has pink tires. And you said, how do you come with pink tires? And then the manufacturer says, well, you didn't specify them to be black. So everybody is thinking, you have a car and it has black tires. And then you go to the manufacturer, oh, you don't like pink? Well, we can make them in green if you like. And how do you get by those unspoken assumptions? Is there a kind of catch all that you don't want anything funny?
I don't know that you can ever get, I mean, it's risk management, to go back to Paul's comment, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you don't put these things in, you have a much higher risk of having issues than if you put these things in. But you never take the risk to zero. And there are things that come up like the new regulations around RoHS. Well, 10 years before RoHS, we couldn't have anticipated that you'd need to have material composition in the specs. So it's not going to remove the issues that come up, but at least that you can kind of get some of the low or mid-hanging fruit and eliminate a number of issues that are easily anticipated.
I would like to add one small piece to it. Obviously, I hang my hat on this concept of risk management, right? I think it's all there, but there's one more fundamental element to your point, Luke, right? Because you cannot address every point in something as complex as production, right? And it's always, things will pop up. So I'm always also listening for the ability to communicate with clients. If their motivation is strictly price, I actually have learned I'm getting too old to, you know what, so I back off. I'm looking for relationship communication standards. Can we communicate? Are the philosophical ideas, are the cultural values of risk management in place? Then we go through details. I'm working with a client right now. We want to go to the design level. At the design level, we say, let's address your DFM's, design for manufacturing strategy, so that it allows for a last mile manufacturing, allows for you to protect your IP, allows you for, as you get feedback from the customer, to iterate and change your product into a modular fashion, right? Those are philosophical ideas that I'm looking for to say, okay, now let's partner. Now let's take you to the moon.
I think it's also important that you build a relationship with your as a supplier and a client. So I think it's wise just to start off small, and then by sometimes you know what you have, what kind of meat you have in the offering, then you start going big.
Yep. Another method, and it's a reason that I'll go back to that, for the company, you draw your whole fulfillment chain and figure out what's going on in each of those areas. Because as you discover those risks, as you discover those things that you missed, you can bring that into your risk procedure, and at least the next time you won't get a car with pink tires. I also want to acknowledge Ed's comment about who pays for and how scrap rates are managed. That's one of the ones that I think is often missed. Rework costs, recall costs, things like that are other aspects of that with issues with supplying.
If I may, Maren, just to put, I'm sorry, I've been trying to multitask and I'm rubbish at it. Let me just explain to everybody. We had our contract manufacturer come to us and say, hey guys, we're going to have to put up our component of the assembly of your device by, I think it was like 50%. And we're like, what? How did that go so wrong? When we looked through the numbers, they said, well, we're losing money on every one of these things that we're doing. We found out their scrap rate was at 25, 30%.
Yep.
We explained to them that actually they're throwing away a whole bunch of stuff that we paid for, we gave to them, and trusting them to do their job professionally. And we explained that if they could get their scrap rate down to like 2 to 5%, where it should be, that all their problems would go away and they wouldn't have to put our prices up. They didn't understand algebra.
And that's another
They
piece
do
that
it.
I didn't put in information, but
We're in the process, Michelle. We're in the process.
I'm going to call it here because this is T-minus 2 business days before I fly to California. I have a little bit of conference stuff to prepare for y'all. And Patricia is bringing her dog, so you dog lovers will have someone to pet. Oh, hello. What's up? Oh, Bubbles, right?
Yeah, Bubbles.
Did you have a little girl name the animal?
Yes, my daughter named her Bubbles. There's a cartoon character named Bubbles during
Oh,
that.
you mean Powerpuff Girls?
Yes.
How old is your daughter now?
I would like to say she's younger, but she's not. So she's 27, which makes me look older, you know.
How old is the dog?
The dog is 10. The dog is 10. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
By
I
the
was
way,
thinking
Joe,
that maybe she was 3 at the time, 4 or 5 at the most.
but
Hey, we all mature at different speeds. So
hey, Joe, since you're talking animals, I honored you and I named a new rescue horse who's now an inside horse after you.
you named a horse after me. It's called Joe Hage.
Just Joe. We didn't do the H part. But yeah, can you see my screen?
I can.
That's Joey. We rescued him 3 weeks ago.
I see similarities.
Oh, shit.
You see
I
them
will
now,
say
right?
I will say I have been called a horse's ass before, but never a horse. So this is really a step up. Thank you very much. This is quite an honor. And if you can,
Right?
bring Joe next week, that would be. We're looking forward to Bubbles. Don't get me wrong, but Joe would be a real treat.
Joe comes to the office sometimes, so next time we get on one of these calls, I'll bring him in here.
Please do. Or take your call outside if you need to.
No, he's an inside horse.
He's in the house right now.
No, he comes in and out all the time. I mean, he was outside. He currently,
But tell the folks that you live in a barn.
yeah, kind of. Yeah, I live on a horse ranch within the Navajo reservation. Used to be a Silicon Valley guy, but when the pandemic hit, I bounced. So
Nice.
I told
Ladies
the
and gentlemen,
Navajo.
very
I told the-
much looking forward to seeing you next week. And for those of you who can't come, next week's call is simply starring all of us, and it's called What You Missed at 10X. So we'll talk about that next week. For Joe Hage and Joe Hage Enterprises, this has been Joe Hage. Thanks, everybody. See you next week in person. Bye.